The most successful drug trafficker in the history of the illicit narcotics business is someone you've probably never heard of, but I promise you, he is the godfather of narco trafficking and had a bigger global impact on the criminal underworld than any other outlaw of the 20th century. His name is Jorge Ochoa from Medellin, Colombia. Before we get into this video, as always, make sure to leave us a like and a comment and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. It really helps us out and we do appreciate it. Also, I just want to remind everyone that I am not here to glorify drugs, drug trafficking, or criminality of any kind. I know from firsthand experience that this sort of lifestyle leads to nowhere but destruction. These videos are for educational and entertainment purposes only. Okay, disclaimer out of the way, let's get into it. You're asking yourself, what constitutes success in a world as deadly and volatile as drug trafficking? I break it down into a few metrics. Of course, everyone's definition of success is different. I'm sure people think a guy like the character of Tony Montana was successful because he rose from abject poverty to making millions of dollars a month. He lived in a mansion and he had a pet tiger. But as we all know, he ended up face down in his own pool, riddled with bullets at the end. So I'd rather be Sosa any day of the week. To me personally, the definition of success in the drug business is making enough money to create generational wealth while avoiding jail time and, if possible, violence. That's a big one. I've met pot dealers who I grew up with in the Northwest who made millions of dollars, never did a day in jail, and never had to hurt anyone. To me, you can't ask for anything more in this game, but I get it. That was an exception to the rule. We have to judge each man on this list by the time and the place that he grew up in. The cocaine business in Medellin, Colombia in the 1970s was a lot different than the marijuana business in Portland, Oregon in the 2010s. So we have to reserve our moral judgment when it comes to violence. Most people, including drug lords, are just products of their environment. So with violence aside, here are my main criteria for judging success in the world of narco trafficking. Money. How much did they make? And most importantly, how much of it did they keep? Almost every drug trafficker, myself included, spends everything they make or loses it all to the government when they go away to prison. As they say in business, it's not how much you make, it's how much you keep. And keeping money in the drug game and even using it to create generational wealth by parlaying it into legitimate industries is exceedingly rare. The next is longevity. How long did the individual or organization last on the street before they got arrested? This correlates a little bit with the amount of money they made. Prison time. Did they escape the all too common Chapo Guzman fate of doing life in an American maximum security prison? Even if you get away with hundreds of millions of dollars, there isn't much to spend it on at ADX Florence. Finally, did they survive? Did they avoid being killed like so many thousands of other drug traffickers, especially of that era, the wild 1970s and 1980s? Now, of course, Pablo Escobar was killed after a legendary run, and I think most of us would say we'd prefer that fate over Chapo's, who's withering away in an American prison for the rest of his life. So we'll count that fate, life in prison, as the same as death in our scorekeeping. Also, I don't want to leave out snitching or cooperating as a category. This drops you down a peg just on general principle. I don't really need to explain this. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the list of the all-time greatest drug traffickers. Number 5. The Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, the founders of the Cali Cartel, one of the original super cartels and what many call the most powerful drug trafficking organization on earth. I struggled with this one. I went back and forth. I could have easily given this spot to Pablo Escobar, who of course was their competition at the time. Both of these cartels are the OGs, the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts of the cocaine industry. Never again will anyone have it like Cali or Medellin. Both organizations made untold billions and lasted for nearly 20 years. However, I have to give the edge to the Orejuela brothers over Pablo Escobar for several reasons. First off, they lasted longer. Their organization wasn't officially disbanded until 1995, 2 years after Pablo Escobar's death. And even while they were in a Colombian prison, the brothers continued to run coke smuggling until 2003, when they were finally extradited to the United States. Secondly, when it comes to money made, Pablo spent his last 5 or 6 years of his life on the run from the Colombian and American governments. Plus, he was engaged in full-on war with paramilitary groups and leftist guerrillas. All of this is very expensive to keep up, and this violence no doubt cut substantially into his bottom line. So by the end of his life, who knows how much money he really had? The Orejuelas, on the other hand, managed to keep a large part of their wealth long after they were arrested. While they were in the game, they were the low-key ones. Yes, Pablo did dominate most of the American market, but the Cali cartel pioneered drug markets in Europe, Australia, and Asia. Instead of making war or running for political office like Pablo, they kept a low profile and laundered their drug proceeds into scores of legitimate businesses, including the most popular pharmacy chain in Colombia, Drogas de la Rebaja, which is like the equivalent of CVS here in the United States. Yes, they did eventually have to forfeit $2.1 billion in assets to avoid prosecution of their extended family members, but in coke money alone, the brothers probably made 10 times that during their heyday. Their children and grandchildren went on to become high-level professionals, doctors, lawyers, industrialists, and were educated at the best international schools. So it's very likely that at least some of their fortune was not seized by authorities and made its way down their lineage and created that generational wealth that I spoke about earlier as a criteria for success in the drug game. Now, yes, both of them were eventually sentenced to 30 years in federal prison in the United States, where Gilberto actually recently just died after being denied a compassionate release for incurable cancer that he developed. This sucks, no doubt about it, but at least they weren't confined to a supermax like Chapo is. They were in medium security facilities and got to live with the general population, had access to visitors, letters, cell phones, and everything else that comes with having money in a lower level prison. Those places are at least tolerable. And Miguel, assuming he stays healthy, is set to be released in 2029, so he will actually get to go back to Colombia and live out the rest of his days with his family, which is pretty wild considering that he sold more cocaine than any living person on Earth. Still, based on the time that he'll have spent in prison, which will be almost 40 years, and the fact that his brother died in an American prison, which is any foreign narco's nightmare, the Orejuela brothers must be okay with being 5th on my list. Number 4, the Kinahan Cartel out of Ireland. I did a video on these guys a few months back. They've had one of the most remarkable runs in narco trafficking history. Chrissy and his son Daniel are probably the most wanted drug traffickers in Europe right now. They're actually famous over there, like Chapo was in Mexico, and these guys are still active. They have not been locked up yet. Chrissy began the cartel in the late 1990s, importing cocaine into Ireland, and since then he hasn't spent a day in jail. He relocated to Spain in the mid-2000s and ran the cartel remotely from the Costa del Sol, where he created sophisticated smuggling routes from South America into Africa, up into Spain, and then the rest of Europe. And he always stayed a step ahead of the law. After an extradition warrant was issued for him by the Irish government in 2016, he and the crew picked up shop and moved from Spain to Dubai, where they remain to this day. And although the walls seem to be closing in on them, they continue to coordinate gigantic, multi-ton shipments of cocaine from South America into Ireland and mainland Europe, basically unabated. There's even reports of them working with members of the Russian secret police to move product into Russia. Interpol estimates that they are a $1 to $2 billion organization, which is a fortune in today's highly competitive and highly policed narcotics industry. That, coupled with the fact that they are literally public figures at this point. Chrissy is in the Irish and British tabloids all of the time. He's getting his picture snapped in public, and yet they remain free. To me, the Kinahans embody the image of the new era of drug kingpin. Low-key, highly tech-savvy, an understanding of international shipping and logistics, highly cooperative with other players in the trade, and basically non-violent. Still, their world continues to shrink as the United States just froze all of their assets in Dubai last year, and the UAE canceled their business license, which they were using to set up shell companies to launder their money. So, no doubt about it, Chrissy and the clan have been taking big financial hits lately, and compared to the net worth of the Colombian or Mexican cartels of yesteryear, they look more middle class. Also, they have arrest warrants waiting for them in Ireland, where they're almost certain to be sentenced to life terms if they're ever extradited, so they can probably never voluntarily return to their homelands again, which sucks. They now find themselves living in permanent exile, which is a bit like being in prison to me. Still, for their ability to remotely traffic cocaine from South America to Ireland while being marooned all the way in Dubai with $1 million bounties on their heads from Interpol, Ireland, and the United States, with all of that, and they are still in the game after 25 years. That's exceptional, and that's why they make number 4 on my list. Number 3, Frank Mathews, one of the most fascinating enigmatic drug kingpins of his era. He was one of the so-called Black Godfathers of Harlem back in the early 70s, along with other heroin legends like Nicky Barnes, Frank Lucas, Pee Wee Kirkland, and the like. Frank was no ordinary drug kingpin. This guy had vision and balls. He immigrated to New York City from North Carolina back in the early 1960s when he was just a teenager, and he got a job working in a barbershop that also doubled as a number betting office. This is where he learned the number running game, and he started to meet a lot of Italian guys from different mafia families through this numbers shop. And it was these mobsters who would later put young Frank Mathews down with his first heroin package. By the late 1960s, Frank was not only supplying the busiest retail corners in Harlem with French Connection heroin, but according to the DEA, he was also the main wholesale supplier of smack in every major U.S. city on the East Coast. They estimated by 1972, he was profiting $10 million a year, which is like 40 or 50 million in today's money. And he was a visionary. Before any drug crews were seriously dealing with cocaine, Frank was copping wholesale kilo bricks from the Cuban mafia, which was starting to grow in prominence in Miami at the time. He even organized a convention of Black and Latino drug traffickers in Las Vegas, a commission of sorts, to discuss how to break the middleman monopoly on pure heroin that was held by the Italian mafia at that time. Here is this black guy, country bumpkin, with a 7th grade education, but he's acting like an Italian mafia boss. He even bought a mansion on Staten Island. Incredible. Then in early 1973, he finally gets popped on a wiretap discussing the sale of 40 pounds of cocaine, which was a lot of blow for that time. He posted a $325,000 bail, scooped up his girlfriend and $20 million in a suitcase. Then, one afternoon, he walked into Small's Paradise, a popular restaurant in Harlem, and was never seen again. Gone. Vanished into thin air. The DEA speculates he may have flown to the Bahamas to settle a score with a Genovese mobster who he'd had beef with over some stolen heroin back in New York, but nobody really knows, and nobody ever will. Frank is still on the DEA's most wanted list to this day, over 50 years later. In terms of longevity, money made and money kept, and avoiding jail time, Frank Mathews checks all of the boxes of one of the most successful kingpins of all time. Number 2, the runner-up for greatest of all time, Ismael Mayo Zambada. We all know this cat by now. He is the last of Los Señores, the only active kingpin left standing from the original Guadalajara cartel started by Miguel Felix Gallardo in the early 1980s. In his half a century of drug trafficking, Don Ismael has pushed literally countless bales of marijuana, bricks of cocaine and heroin, pounds of methamphetamine, and now fentanyl. And he has never spent one night inside of a jail cell. GOAT status. Just like the rest of the early Dons, Mayo got his start as a pot farmer in the mountains of Sinaloa back in the 1970s. As the other pot farming clans of northern Mexico began to organize themselves into cartels, Don Ismael immigrated north for a time to Los Angeles, where he established connections and the first lucrative buying market for Mexican marijuana in the United States. He worked in the shadows, and in a business filled with hotheads, he was known as a peacekeeper. While other cartels shot to stardom in the 1980s, thanks to the newly minted cocaine routes into the United States, Mayo played it slow and steady and continued to build up his clientele in the United States and Europe, as well as solidify his connections and his allies within the Mexican government, which was probably the smartest thing he ever did. After the Guadalajara cartel split up in the early 1990s, Mayo formed what is today the Sinaloa Cartel, along with Joaquin Chapo Guzman and Arturo Beltran Leyva. And as time went on, one by one, the top members of the Sinaloa Cartel began to get knocked off. First, Arturo Leyva, and then, of course, Chapo in 2015. So, 45 years and so many arrests, killings, and extraditions later, Mayo is the last man standing. Although he's pushing 80 years old, suffers from diabetes, and has a $15 million reward from the DEA on his head, the old man isn't slowing down. In fact, this year, he had another superseding indictment from the American feds released against him for major fentanyl trafficking. That's like 5 DEA kingpin indictments that he has now. He is also in control of lucrative smuggling routes on the southern Mexico border with Guatemala, and he seems to be winning the war with Los Chapitos, the remnants of the Sinaloa Cartel faction loyal to Chapo. This guy just doesn't stop. He's the Donald Trump of drug trafficking, except unlike Trump, it is likely that they will never be able to catch Mayo. He lives on the run in the mountainous regions of Sinaloa and is surrounded by armies of sicarios at all times. He is firmly entrenched not only with the locals in the area, but corrupt politicians at almost every level of the Mexican government. There's a strong case for putting Mayo as #1 on the all-time greatest list. His longevity, the volume of product he moved, and the generational wealth he's created with it all qualify him for GOAT status. However, as most of us know by now, he's a snitch. That's right, you heard me. There have been rumors going back decades now about how Mayo feeds his partners and associates to the DEA and Mexican authorities in order to get the heat off of himself. In fact, his own sons testified against Chapo at his trial in New York City. There's even an intercepted wiretap of Mayo on the phone with his son Vicente, who was in jail in Chicago at the time, where Mayo actually gives his son his blessings to go ahead and give up intel on Chapo to the DEA. Even now, the biggest news coming out of Sinaloa are the arrest of Chapo's sons. But Mayo is curiously missing from these big headlines, despite the fact that he's got a $15 million bounty on his head. That doesn't make any sense to me. Now look, to be fair, history shows us that most of the big kingpins and mafia figures ended up telling after they got jammed up. And as we've been learning, in Mexico, at least among the kingpins, there is no stigma around informing on rivals or associates. It's understood to be a dog-eat-dog business, where only the shrewdest survive. It is a cutthroat game of chess, and so far, Mayo is undefeated. Still, I said at the beginning of this video that snitching would drop you down a point, and I'm good to my word. So, old man Mayo will just have to be satisfied with being #2 on the greatest of all time list. And that brings us to the #1 spot, a guy who I think just on paper is undeniably a narco success story beyond your average drug dealer's wildest dreams. It is that of Jorge Ochoa, co-founder of the Medellin Cartel, the inventor of the global cocaine trade, and the richest criminal to ever walk the face of the earth. Unlike the vast majority of drug lords, Jorge Ochoa did not grow up in poverty. It's actually the opposite. He's from what would be considered an oligarchic family of successful horse breeders, started by his father, Fabio Ochoa. Now, a lot of people have tried to say old man Fabio was actually the patriarch of the Medellin Cartel and that he controlled Pablo Escobar. But there's never been any evidence of that, and I personally think it's just narco lore. But his son Jorge, as well as 2 of Jorge's younger brothers, were most definitely involved with the Medellin Cartel. In fact, Popoy, or Popeye, the infamous hitman for Pablo Escobar, who got out of prison and was all over the internet a while back, that guy, has stated in an interview that Jorge Ochoa was the true boss of the cartel, not Pablo. In reality, the Medellin Cartel didn't have a boss. It had multiple bosses with their own crews who operated autonomously under them. And one of these bosses happened to be Jorge. You see, back in the 1970s, when demand for cocaine really started ramping up in Colombia, traffickers from Medellin were all over the place. Everyone was exporting product to the US. But if and when that product got seized en route to America, that meant somebody back in Colombia was getting whacked. Violence amongst these loose trafficking gangs was rampant until one day Pablo and Jorge hatched an idea. They came up with a proposal. They would allow other traffickers to send their product along with their own on the same drug routes that they used, and furthermore, they would assume the cost of any lost product along the way, in exchange for a 15% royalty of all sales after the cocaine made it safely to the United States. It was literally an insurance policy for their cocaine. Ingenious. And that's how the Medellin Cartel was actually formed. Now, most of us know the legacy of Pablo Escobar and his epic rise and downfall, and the billions and billions of dollars that he and his associates, including Jorge, earned over the years. And we also know how it ended for him. A bullet through the eyes on the roof of a safe house in Medellin. But what happened to the Ochoas? Well, they fared much better, to say the least. In September of 1990, amidst astronomical levels of violence being perpetuated against the Colombian government and civilians, most of it at the hands of Escobar, Colombian President Cesar Gaviria Trujillo made a declaration. He offered drug traffickers reduced prison sentences if they voluntarily turned themselves in. I guess this seemed like a pretty good deal for Jorge, who Forbes magazine had just listed as one of the world's 20 richest men with an estimated net worth of $3 billion. And his associate, Pablo Escobar, meanwhile, was being chased by 2 armies all over Colombia and getting in gunfights every day. Jorge recognized, accurately, that this would be his last chance to make a deal before death or extradition to the United States became a non-negotiable. So he took it. In January of 1991, he turned himself over to Colombian authorities, who allowed him to serve his sentence in Colombia. Then in 1996, after just 5.5 years behind bars, he was released for good behavior. Just like that, it was that easy. After making $3 billion, moving an estimated 6 metric tons of blow every month for the most violent and infamous criminal organization in modern history, and he did less time than some people get for their 3rd DUI. Will never be repeated again. Not only did Jorge Ochoa have incredible longevity, over 15 years involved with the Medellin Cartel, there's no evidence that he lost any of those billions that he made after he got sent to prison. In fact, that was part of the surrender deal that the Colombian government was offering the traffickers at the time. They guaranteed that they would not be extradited to the US and that none of their assets would be seized. Unbelievable. So, not only is Jorge alive and well to this day, he made billions in generational wealth that never got seized, he never had to rat on anyone, and best of all, he's not living on the run. Sure, Frank Matthews and the Kinahans and Mayo have never been to prison, but they have to live permanently in hiding, which is incredibly stressful and expensive. It's also not really freedom. For example, Mayo is forced to stay in a small radius in the mountains of Sinaloa, the only place he's really safe, which to me is kind of like living in a bigger prison but outside of the walls. Jorge has none of those problems. He moves around as a free, very rich man in Colombia and wherever else he wants to be. For these reasons, I declare Jorge Ochoa the greatest drug trafficker of all time. All right, you guys, that's been today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. Leave us a like and a comment. Follow me on Instagram. Subscribe to the channel. We will see you next time. Take care.